By December 1941, the German army on the Eastern Front faced a crisis without precedent. What had begun 6 months earlier as the largest invasion in military history now approached systemic failure. Operation Barbarossa, designed to destroy the Soviet Union in a single campaign, had stalled across its entire length. German forces stood exhausted in front of Moscow. Temperatures dropped far below zero. Vehicles failed. Weapons malfunctioned. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers beyond their capacity. Units that had advanced relentlessly since June were reduced to fractions of their original strength. The Red Army, believed to be on the verge of collapse, launched a counteroffensive. Soviet forces struck along multiple sectors, exploiting German overextension and fatigue. Divisions that had not prepared defensive positions were pushed back or encircled. Entire corps reported loss of cohesion. Communications broke down. Withdrawal routes became impassable under snow and ice. German casualty reports escalated rapidly. Tens of thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or frozen within weeks. Equipment losses mounted. Horses, essential to German logistics, died in massive numbers. Ammunition and fuel could not be delivered in sufficient quantities. At the front, commanders recognized the danger immediately. The Wehrmacht had not planned for sustained winter operations. Defensive depth was minimal. Units lacked winter clothing. Many officers concluded that orderly withdrawal to shorter defensible lines was the only way to preserve combat capability. Historically, German doctrine allowed for such withdrawals. Operational flexibility had been a defining feature of German success earlier in the war. Retreat was not synonymous with defeat. It was a means of restoring balance. This time, retreat was forbidden. On the 16th of December 1941, Adolf Hitler issued orders that fundamentally altered the conduct of the war in the East. German units were instructed to hold their positions at all costs. No unauthorized withdrawal was permitted. Ground was to be defended regardless of circumstances. The order reached frontline formations already under pressure. Commanders who attempted limited pullbacks to stabilize their lines were reprimanded or relieved. Requests for maneuver were denied. Initiative was centralized at the highest level. The effect was immediate. Units that might have disengaged became fixed targets. Soviet forces exploited immobile German positions. Encirclements multiplied. Losses accelerated. The front did not stabilize. It fractured. The collapse was no longer local. It became structural. By early January 1942, large sections of the German front had ceased to function as an integrated system. Army groups reported conflicting situations simultaneously, sectors collapsing, others holding only through extreme attrition. The concept of a continuous front line lost meaning. Hitler interpreted resistance as proof of correctness. Reports emphasizing isolated successes were highlighted. Warnings describing exhaustion and disintegration were dismissed as defeatism. The refusal to retreat became a test of loyalty as much as a military directive. Within the German command structure, the psychological impact was severe. Senior officers understood that the order violated operational reality, but open opposition carried professional and personal risk. Compliance replaced judgment. The result was irreversible damage. By the end of the winter, the Wehrmacht had lost hundreds of thousands of experienced soldiers. Entire divisions were rendered combat ineffective. The strategic initiative on the Eastern Front shifted permanently. The collapse of 1941 was not caused by Soviet strength alone. It was accelerated by a decision that eliminated flexibility at the moment it was most required. The Eastern Front did not recover from that winter.
The collapse of the front raised an immediate question inside the German command. Not how the situation could be stabilized, but how it should be understood. For Adolf Hitler, the crisis of winter 1941 was not interpreted as a military failure requiring operational adjustment. He understood it differently. He understood it as a test of will. Hitler believed that Germany's defeat in the First World War had not occurred because the army had been beaten in the field. In his view, it had collapsed internally, through hesitation, through loss of resolve, through retreat. This belief shaped every conclusion he drew in 1941. To Hitler, withdrawal was never a neutral maneuver. It was the beginning of disintegration. Once movement backward was permitted, discipline weakened. Once discipline weakened, collapse followed. As German units stalled before Moscow and Soviet counteroffensives gathered strength, Hitler did not see an army in need of flexibility. He saw the danger of repetition. The same psychological failure he believed had destroyed Germany in 1918. This interpretation became his explanation. Reports from the front were filtered through that lens. Messages describing exhaustion, exposure, and logistical collapse were reframed as problems of morale. Requests for withdrawal were interpreted not as professional judgment, but as loss of nerve. At the same time, selective evidence reinforced his belief. Isolated cases where German units held their positions under extreme conditions were emphasized. These moments were real, but they were exceptions. They were treated as proof that determination alone could offset material reality. Warnings from senior commanders conflicted with this explanation, and so they were discounted. By late 1941, Hitler's distrust of the professional officer corps had deepened. Traditional military logic appeared, in his eyes, cautious, conservative, unsuitable for what he defined as an existential war. This war, he believed, could not be fought by maneuver alone. It required absolute rigidity, absolute obedience, absolute resistance. The explanation offered simplicity. Complex operational problems were reduced to a single variable: resolve. If units held their ground, the crisis would pass. If they retreated, defeat would accelerate. This binary logic eliminated ambiguity. It also eliminated adaptability. Orders issued from headquarters reflected this shift. Positions were to be held regardless of conditions. Withdrawal without authorization was forbidden. Local initiative was replaced by centralized control. Inside the German command structure, the explanation was not universally accepted. Many officers understood the consequences. Static defense under winter conditions invited encirclement. Attrition would destroy units faster than maneuver ever could. But dissent carried risk. Commanders who challenged the explanation faced removal or marginalization. Language in reports softened. Warnings were qualified. The full scale of collapse was no longer conveyed with clarity. The explanation hardened into doctrine. Every setback could be blamed on insufficient execution. Every limited success could be cited as confirmation. Contradiction was no longer evidence. It was disloyalty. For frontline soldiers, the effect was uneven. Some interpreted the order to hold as confidence from above. Others understood it as abandonment. As supplies failed to arrive and relief did not come, resolve alone proved insufficient. By framing the crisis as a moral test rather than a military problem, Hitler closed the door to reassessment. The explanation did not adapt to reality. It denied it. And as this interpretation became absolute, the space for professional judgment disappeared. What followed was no longer debate. It was enforcement. The explanation would soon become policy, and policy would become disaster.
The explanation did not remain an interpretation. It hardened. What began as belief became certainty, and certainty became policy. By late December 1941, Hitler no longer questioned his assessment of the crisis. The front was not collapsing, he believed. It was being tested, and the conclusion he drew was decisive. The German army had not failed because it had advanced too far. It had failed because it had not resisted strongly enough. This was the wrong conclusion. From Hitler's perspective, the evidence seemed to support it. In isolated sectors, German units that held their ground did not collapse immediately. Some Soviet attacks stalled against rigid defenses. These limited outcomes were elevated into proof. They were treated as confirmation that withdrawal, not overextension, was the true danger. Reports that contradicted this view were reinterpreted. Losses were blamed on poor execution. Encirclements were explained as lack of resolve. Requests for maneuver were framed as psychological weakness. The logic became circular. If units held, the decision was correct. If they failed, it was because they had not held hard enough. This reasoning removed operational context. Terrain, supply, weather, and exhaustion were no longer decisive factors. They became secondary, or irrelevant. The wrong conclusion also altered command relationships. Initiative was withdrawn from the front. Authority was centralized. Local commanders were no longer trusted to judge when to disengage. Orders became absolute. Positions were to be held regardless of cost. Withdrawal without authorization was forbidden. Movement was treated as disobedience. The front was no longer elastic. It was fixed. This rigidity produced predictable results. Units unable to maneuver became vulnerable to encirclement. Losses increased. Combat effectiveness declined faster than territory could be held. But these outcomes did not challenge the conclusion. They reinforced it. Each collapse was interpreted as proof that discipline had been insufficient. Each survival was treated as validation of the order. By early January 1942, the German command structure had adjusted to the new reality. Not through agreement, through compliance. Professional judgment gave way to enforcement. Reports were written to align with expectations. Warnings were softened. Reality was filtered. The wrong conclusion had achieved dominance. At the front, officers understood what it meant. They could no longer retreat to save their units. They could only endure. What had once been operational failure now became systemic destruction. The German army was not being defeated by maneuver alone. It was being consumed by immobility. And yet, within the highest level of command, the conclusion remained intact. The front would hold. If it did not, the fault would lie with those who lacked will. The decision was no longer open to revision. It had become doctrine. The next stage would not involve debate or reassessment. It would involve enforcement. And enforcement would bring consequences.
The wrong conclusion had already taken hold.
But it did not go unchallenged. Warnings existed. They came early, and they came repeatedly. From the front, commanders reported conditions that could not be solved by endurance alone. Units were overextended. Supply lines were collapsing. Winter equipment was insufficient. Defensive depth did not exist. These reports were factual, they were specific, and they were consistent. Senior officers warned that static defense invited encirclement. They emphasized that Soviet forces retained operational reserves. They noted that continued pressure without maneuver would destroy formations faster than retreat ever could. Some proposed limited withdrawals, not rout, not collapse, controlled movement to shorter lines. These were not acts of panic. They were standard operational recommendations. They were ignored. At higher headquarters, the warnings encountered resistance, not because they lacked evidence, but because they conflicted with the accepted conclusion. If withdrawal was forbidden, then any recommendation to withdraw became suspect. It implied doubt, and doubt was no longer acceptable. Language began to change. Reports were rewritten. Terms like critical became difficult. Unsustainable became challenging. Warnings were softened before they reached the top. Some officers stopped pressing the issue, not because conditions improved, but because persistence carried consequences. Requests for maneuver were increasingly interpreted as defeatism.
Commanders who acted without authorization were relieved, others were reassigned. The message was clear. Holding ground was obedience. Withdrawal was disloyalty. As a result, the flow of information narrowed. What reached Hitler was no longer a full picture, it was a filtered one. Warnings did not disappear, they lost urgency. At the front, the consequences were immediate. Units remained in exposed positions, encirclements tightened, casualties mounted. Officers understood the reality, but they no longer had the authority to act on it. The ignored warning was not a single message, it was a process. Each report that failed to change policy reinforced the belief that resistance alone was sufficient. Each punished commander discouraged the next warning. By early January 1942, the system no longer corrected itself. It enforced. The German army was now locked into a posture it could not sustain, and the warnings that might have prevented disaster had been absorbed without effect. What followed would not be gradual. It would be decisive. The moment was approaching when theory would meet consequence. The theory was now in place. The orders had been issued. The warnings had been set aside. Winter 1941 became the test. The test was simple. Could rigid defense replace maneuver under sustained pressure? The Red Army provided the answer. In December and January, Soviet forces expanded their counteroffensives along multiple sectors. They did not seek immediate annihilation. They sought collapse through pressure. German units were forced to fight where they stood, without depth, without mobility, without relief. At first, some positions held. Isolated Soviet attacks were repelled. Local successes were reported upward. These reports were highlighted. They were used as proof. The test, however, was not local. It was cumulative. As days passed, German formations lost cohesion. Frostbite casualties increased. Weapons failed. Vehicles froze. Supply convoys did not arrive. Units ordered to hold could no longer maneuver out of danger. Encirclements tightened. Breakouts were denied or delayed. What doctrine had once avoided now occurred repeatedly. The Red Army adapted quickly. It identified static positions. It bypassed resistance. It isolated strong points and reduced them methodically. German commanders at the front understood the pattern, but understanding did not grant permission. Requests for withdrawal continued. They were rejected. The test continued. By January 1942, the results were unmistakable. Divisions that had survived months of advance were being destroyed in place. Combat effectiveness collapsed faster than territory could be held. What the test revealed was not weakness of soldiers. It revealed the limits of rigidity. Holding ground did not preserve force, it consumed it. The doctrine failed under sustained pressure. Not immediately, but inevitably. Yet even now the conclusion was resisted. Losses were attributed to insufficient discipline. Failures were blamed on execution. The order itself remained unquestioned. The test had been conducted. The results were clear. They were not accepted. The next stage would no longer be theoretical. It would be irreversible. The test had ended. The results were no longer ambiguous. By mid-January 1942, the structure of the German front began to fail. Not at a single point, but across the system. Units ordered to hold had exhausted their capacity to resist. Frostbite casualties equaled combat losses. Ammunition ran low. Food deliveries failed. Medical evacuation became impossible. Positions that still existed on maps no longer existed in reality. The break was operational. Static defense, once imposed as discipline, became paralysis. German formations could not reposition. They could not disengage. They could not restore cohesion. When Soviet forces penetrated between fixed positions, the result was not retreat. It was collapse.
Entire battalions disappeared from command reports. Some were overrun, others surrendered after isolation. Many simply ceased to function as organized units. The front no longer behaved as a line. It behaved as fragments. Attempts to restore control failed. Orders issued from higher headquarters arrived too late. Communications broke down. Local commanders lacked authority to adapt. The break exposed the core flaw of the doctrine. Holding ground had preserved neither territory nor force. It had traded both for time, and time had run out. At this stage, even limited withdrawals could no longer be conducted in an orderly manner. What might have been maneuver weeks earlier became escape under pressure. Routes were blocked, equipment was abandoned, units retreated without structure. The Red Army exploited the situation systematically. It bypassed strongpoints, it sealed pockets, it applied pressure until resistance collapsed. German command assessments now acknowledged the severity of the situation, but acknowledgement did not produce reversal. The order remained in effect. Losses were explained as necessary sacrifice. The failure of units was blamed on endurance, not policy. The concept itself was not questioned. The break, therefore, widened. Army groups reported contradictory conditions simultaneously. Some sectors held briefly through extreme attrition. Others disintegrated entirely. The system no longer corrected failure. It absorbed it. By February 1942, the Wehrmacht had lost hundreds of thousands of experienced soldiers. Divisions that had formed the core of earlier successes were no longer combat capable. Replacements lacked training, cohesion, and equipment. The Eastern Front had crossed a threshold. The damage was not temporary. It was irreversible. The break marked the end of Germany's operational superiority in the East. From this point forward, the initiative would shift gradually, but permanently. Yet even now, the decision that caused the break remained unchanged. The collapse was no longer theoretical. It was measured in destroyed units and lost capability. What followed would be recognition. Not public, not immediate, but unavoidable.
The break could no longer be denied. But recognition did not arrive publicly. It emerged quietly, inside reports, inside memoranda, inside silence. By late winter 1942, German command assessments began to change in tone, not in language of admission, but in language of damage control. Operational summaries acknowledged what could no longer be hidden. Entire divisions were no longer combat effective. Equipment losses exceeded replacement capacity. Veteran formations had ceased to exist as formations. The realization was not emotional. It was administrative. Strength reports told the story. Battalions listed on paper were absent in reality. Commanders reported units that could hold ground only nominally, not through resistance, but through absence of alternatives. The winter had done what maneuver could not. It had stripped the army of elasticity. Within the high command, some officers understood the implication. The refusal to retreat had preserved no advantage. It had converted temporary crisis into permanent loss. This understanding did not produce reversal. It produced adjustment. Planning documents shifted focus from offensive ambition to stabilization, from breakthrough to containment. The realization spread unevenly. Some commanders adapted mentally. Others continued to enforce doctrine without belief. Hitler's interpretation remained unchanged. Losses were reframed as sacrifice. Destruction was treated as proof of endurance. Responsibility remained external, but the system had absorbed the truth. The Wehrmacht of 1942 was not the army of 1941. Its experience base was gone, its initiative constrained, its margin for error erased.
The realization was final in one sense. The Eastern Front could no longer be won through decision, only endured. From this point forward, Germany would react, not shape. The war had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed.
The consequences were not immediate. They unfolded over time, quietly, relentlessly. By the spring of 1942, the German army no longer possessed the force it had committed the year before. The losses of the winter were not replaced. They were absorbed. New divisions arrived, but they lacked experience. They lacked cohesion. They lacked the institutional memory that had defined earlier success. The refusal to retreat had preserved no strategic advantage. It had delayed collapse at specific points, at the cost of destroying the army's capacity to recover. From this point forward, German operations in the East were shaped by limitation. Offensives required extraordinary concentration. Defensive failures carried irreversible consequences. The initiative shifted gradually, but permanently. The Red Army adapted faster. It learned to exploit rigidity. It planned around German immobility. What had once been a temporary weakness became a structural vulnerability. Within the German command system, the lesson was never formally acknowledged. There was no reversal of doctrine, no admission of error. Instead, the pattern repeated. At Stalingrad, at Kursk, in every subsequent crisis. Ground was to be held. Withdrawal was to be resisted. Losses were to be endured. Each repetition carried a higher cost. The verdict, in historical terms, is restrained. Hitler's refusal to retreat in 1941 did not lose the war in a single moment. It ensured that the war could no longer be won. It converted a campaign failure into a strategic condition. It removed flexibility at the moment flexibility mattered most. The Eastern Front did not collapse because German soldiers lacked resolve. It collapsed because resolve was substituted for maneuver. The decision was not tactical. It was ideological, and ideology does not adapt. The order to stand fast destroyed the army's margin for error. Once that margin was gone, defeat became a matter of time. The war in the East would continue for more than 3 years, but its outcome had been shaped in the winter of 1941. The verdict is clear. The refusal to retreat did not prevent defeat. It made it inevitable.